Across towns and cities, vigils flickered against the dark, small flames trembling in cupped hands as if they carried not only light, but memory. Churches and community halls opened their doors, offering quiet spaces for prayer, reflection, and the fragile comfort of shared grief. In classrooms and workplaces, conversations faltered. Routines felt trivial against the weight of what had been lost. Reporters tried to trace the contours of the story, but no headline could capture the fullness of the lives behind the names. Friends spoke of Hannah's laugh, of the way it rose unexpectedly and drew others in. They remembered the children's boundless questions, their small triumphs, the drawings pinned proudly to refrigerator doors. Each recollection added color to what tragedy had threatened to render only in shadow. In the weeks that followed, the community began to shift from shock toward resolve. Meals were organized for relatives, funds were raised in their honor, and discussions emerged about how such pain might be prevented in the future. Grief did not vanish. It settled into quieter corners, but it was joined by a determined tenderness, a promise to look more closely at one another, to ask harder questions, to listen longer. And in that promise, fragile yet persistent, lay the beginning of something that outlasted the sorrow, a collective commitment to remembrance not only through tears, but through care. In living rooms and late-night conversations, the questions lingered long after the candles had burned down to wax. People spoke in hushed tones about fragility, of routines, of certainty, of the quiet assumptions that tomorrow would unfold as gently as yesterday. Grief, once sharp and blinding, began to settle into something slower and more searching, pressing communities to look not only at what had happened, but at what it revealed about care, vigilance, and the unseen struggles carried behind closed doors. Counselors, teachers, and neighbors found themselves listening more closely than before. Small changes in mood, a missed greeting, an unreturned message, details once overlooked, were now met with deeper attention. Out of sorrow grew a cautious compassion, an understanding that presence itself could be a form of protection. Though nothing could rewrite the past, many hoped that gentler awareness might shape the future in ways tragedy never could. And so remembrance became more than mourning. It lived in everyday kindnesses, in questions asked with sincerity, in moments when someone chose to stay a little longer and listen a little harder. In those quiet acts, carried forward day by day, the echo of loss slowly intertwined with a fragile but enduring sense of responsibility, one that asked each person, in their own small way, to help keep another light from going out. Hotlines reported an increase in calls, not only from those in immediate danger, but from friends, relatives, and neighbors seeking to understand how to help. Community organizations found themselves balancing sorrow with action, turning grief into education, outreach, and the steady work of prevention. What had once been whispered behind closed doors was now being named aloud, its silence broken by the shared recognition that awareness could no longer wait. Survivors, some speaking publicly for the first time, offered stories marked by both pain and resilience. Their voices carried a difficult truth, that violence rarely begins in a single moment, but grows in patterns too often dismissed as private matters. Listening to them required courage, yet it also created space for empathy, for policy, and for the possibility of earlier intervention. In hearing these accounts, many began to understand that protection is not only a personal responsibility, but a collective one. As the weeks turned into months, the memory of Hannah and her children remained a quiet presence in these efforts. Not only as a symbol of loss, but as a call to attention, one urging communities to recognize danger sooner, to support survivors more fully, and to refuse the comfort of looking away. And while sorrow still lingered, it now stood beside a growing determination that such silence, once broken, must never be allowed to return. Public hearings filled with testimony that was at once measured and deeply personal. Experts outlined patterns long documented in research, while survivors described the quieter wounds that left no visible mark yet shaped every hour of their lives. The language of the law, once narrow, precise, and distant, began to stretch toward experiences that had too often gone unnamed within official records. Debate followed, sometimes careful, sometimes urgent. Some warned about the difficulty of legislating what could not always be easily seen, while others argued that invisibility had never meant harmlessness. Beneath the policy language lay a shared recognition that protection delayed could become protection denied, and that acknowledging harm was the first step toward preventing it. Outside government chambers, the public watched with a mixture of hope and impatience. For many, change could not come quickly enough. For others, even the willingness to ask new questions felt like movement after years of stillness. Advocacy groups continued their work in courtrooms, shelters, and classrooms, reminding institutions that reform was not a single decision but a sustained commitment. Through it all, remembrance remained the quiet thread connecting grief to responsibility. The loss that had once stunned a community into silence now pressed steadily toward accountability and care. And while no law could undo what had been taken, the possibility remained that attention, honest, persistent, and shared, might shape a future where fewer stories ended in sorrow and more found their way towards safety before the darkness could close in. In the quiet moments after long shifts and difficult conversations, many who worked on the front lines found themselves sitting with questions that had no easy answers. Training and protocol could guide action, but they could not soften the human ache of wondering whether one more visit, one more question, or one more moment of time might have made a difference. These reflections were not rooted in blame, but in care, the kind that lingers long after files are closed and headlines fade. Across agencies, conversations turned toward learning rather than judgment. Reviews were conducted with patience and honesty, seeking not a single point of failure, but a clearer understanding of how complex lives move through complex systems. Collaboration, once limited by structure or distance, began to deepen as professionals looked for ways to close the spaces where vulnerability could go unseen. In this work, grief became a teacher, quiet, insistent, and unwilling to be ignored. For the wider community, recognizing this shared sorrow brought a subtle shift in perspective. The tragedy was no longer viewed only as an isolated act of violence, but as a reminder of how many hands and hearts are connected in the effort to keep one another safe. Responsibility remained where it belonged, yet compassion widened to include all who had tried, in ways seen and unseen, to protect a family now gone. And in that widening compassion lived a fragile kind of healing, not the erasure of pain, but the resolve to carry its meaning forward. Through reflection, reform, and remembrance, the hope persisted that even the heaviest loss might still guide the living toward greater vigilance, deeper empathy, and a future shaped more by care than by regret. Shelters and support networks prepared for the complex wave of emotion that followed, relief for those who reached safety, fear for those still weighing impossible choices, and grief that reopened memories long carried in silence. Advocates emphasized patience, reminding the public that leaving abuse is rarely a single moment of escape, but a gradual and often dangerous process shaped by love, hope, and survival. In counseling rooms, stories unfolded at their own pace. Some survivors spoke in fragments, testing whether their words would be met with belief. Others arrived with years of unspoken truth, releasing it all at once in tears that carried both pain and release. Each voice, however quiet, added to a growing chorus insisting that safety and dignity are not privileges, but rights. Communities, listening more closely now, began to understand that support does not end with sympathy. It lives in practical help, secure housing, legal protection, financial stability, and the steady reassurance that no one must face danger alone. These forms of care, though less visible than public mourning, became the foundations on which new beginnings could stand. And within those beginnings, fragile but real, the meaning of remembrance continued to evolve. The loss that had once been only devastation slowly transformed into resolve, a commitment to believe survivors sooner, to protect them more fully, and to ensure that hope is met not with harm, but with the possibility of a safer life still ahead. Photographs passed gently from hand to hand at gatherings, each image capturing an ordinary moment now made precious by absence. A birthday candle mid-wish, a child's arm wrapped tightly around her shoulder, a smile that seemed to promise years still waiting ahead. In telling these stories, friends created a space where love spoke louder than loss, where memory resisted the narrowing force of tragedy. Laughter, sometimes unexpected and edged with tears, returned in brief flashes as people recalled small, vivid details, the meals she insisted on sharing, the messages she sent just to check in, the quiet ways she made others feel seen. These fragments, simple yet enduring, formed a portrait more truthful than any headline, a life measured not by its ending, but by the care it offered while it was lived. For her children, remembrance carried a different tenderness. Their names were spoken with a softness that held both sorrow and wonder, honoring the futures imagined for them and the joy they had already given. Communities found gentle ways to keep those possibilities present, through scholarships, gardens, and acts of kindness offered in their memory, gestures that turned grief outward into compassion. And in this weaving of memory and meaning, Hannah's story continued to unfold beyond violence. It lived in every kindness inspired by her life, in every moment someone chose protection over silence, and in the enduring belief that love, once given freely, does not disappear. Instead, it lingers, quiet, persistent, and strong enough to guide the living toward a more careful and compassionate world. They spoke with a steadiness that came not from healing, but from purpose. Each interview, each public appearance, required them to reopen wounds that would never fully close, yet they endured the pain so that others might recognize danger sooner, listen more carefully, and act with greater urgency. In their voices lived both heartbreak and love, the enduring devotion of parents who refused to let silence follow loss. Listeners often found themselves moved not only by the depth of their grief, but by the clarity of their message. They did not ask for sympathy alone. They asked for attention, for education, for systems strong enough to protect those who could not protect themselves. Their courage transformed private mourning into a call that reached far beyond their own family, touching strangers who would never meet them, yet felt changed by their resolve. Over time, their advocacy became another form of remembrance. Where sorrow might have remained still, they created movement, supporting awareness campaigns, standing beside survivors, and reminding communities that prevention begins with belief and compassion. In choosing to speak, they carried forward the love they still held, shaping it into something that could guard other lives from similar harm. And though their grief remained immeasurable, it was no longer voiceless. It had become a quiet force for care and vigilance, a testament that even in the deepest darkness, the human will to protect others can endure, gentle, persistent, and strong enough to kindle hope where despair once seemed absolute. Workshops replaced whispers, offering language for experiences that many had felt but never named. Teachers learned to recognize subtle signs of distress, employers reconsidered policies around safety and leave, and community leaders began weaving conversations about healthy relationships into spaces where they had never before existed. Change moved quietly at first, almost imperceptibly, yet its presence could be felt in the growing willingness to look directly at what had long been hidden. For some, these discussions were painful, bringing buried memories to the surface. For others, they were clarifying, illuminating patterns that finally made sense of years of confusion. In both cases, knowledge carried a kind of power, the ability to interrupt harm earlier, to reach for help sooner, and to understand that suffering in silence was never the only path available. The foundations established in Hannah's memory became places not only of mourning, but of movement. Scholarships supported futures she had once dreamed of for her children. Training programs equipped professionals with sharper tools for protection. Public campaigns reminded strangers that vigilance and compassion are everyday responsibilities, not distant ideals. Through these efforts, remembrance took on a living form, active, forward-facing, and determined to spare others the same loss. And as silence continued to recede, something steadier began to take its place. Not certainty, and not the erasure of grief, but a shared commitment to attention, to seeing, to listening, to acting before danger could deepen. In that collective awareness, fragile yet real, lay the possibility that even the most painful story might still shape a safer future for lives yet unfolding. Editorials began asking harder questions, not only about what had happened, but about what had been tolerated, overlooked, or misunderstood. Journalists sought out experts who could explain patterns of coercive control, and they amplified survivor perspectives with greater care and nuance. Language evolved, too. Where stories once leaned towards sensational detail, they increasingly emphasized context, accountability, and the pathways to support. This shift in framing carried quiet power. By treating domestic violence as a systemic issue rather than an isolated tragedy, coverage helped dismantle the myth that such harm exists only within the walls of a single home. It underscored how culture, policy, and community responses shape outcomes long before a crisis makes headlines. In doing so, media became not just a mirror reflecting grief, but a lens clarifying responsibility. Audiences responded in kind. Letters to editors, online forums, and public panels reflected a deeper engagement with prevention, how schools teach relationship skills, how workplaces respond to disclosures, how friends and neighbors intervene when something feels wrong. Awareness was no longer passive. It asked participation. And as the narrative matured, so too did the collective understanding that silence is not neutrality. To look away is to leave space for harm to grow. To look directly and to speak creates the possibility of interruption, of protection, of change. In that evolving conversation, remembrance continued its work, guiding society not only to mourn what was lost, but to reshape the conditions that allowed such loss to occur. In those quiet stretches of living, sorrow often appeared without warning, carried in a familiar song, a passing scent, the shape of laughter heard across a room. Such moments revealed how grief does not fade so much as change, softening at the edges while remaining woven into the fabric of everyday life. Love, once given and unable to find its usual place, searched for new forms of expression, in stories retold, in traditions gently continued, in the careful tending of memory. Some days brought a fragile steadiness, the sense that breathing felt a little less heavy than before. Other days returned with the full weight of absence, reminding them that healing is not a destination but a rhythm, advance and retreat, silence and tears, endurance and rest. Those who walked beside the grieving learned that presence mattered more than words, and that companionship in sorrow could itself be a quiet kind of mercy. Over time, meaning emerged not from forgetting, but from carrying forward what had been loved. Acts of kindness offered in their names, spaces created for reflection, and the simple refusal to let memory disappear became threads binding past to future. In this way, grief and love ceased to stand in opposition. They moved together, shaping a tenderness that endured beyond loss. And though the emptiness never vanished entirely, it was no longer the only truth. Alongside it grew gratitude for what had been shared, and a gentle resolve to live in ways that honored those now absent. Within that balance, fragile, imperfect, yet real, healing found its quiet beginning. That possibility, however delicate, offered something grief alone could not: direction. It turned remembrance outward, shaping choices in courtrooms, classrooms, and quiet personal decisions made far from public view. What began as mourning slowly intertwined with responsibility, suggesting that even the deepest loss might still guard lives not yet touched by harm. People who had once felt powerless discovered small but meaningful ways to act, learning the signs of coercive control, supporting local shelters, checking in on friends whose silence felt different than before. None of these gestures could rewrite what had happened, yet together they formed a quiet network of attention, the kind that can interrupt danger before it fully unfolds. In this way, care became both tribute and prevention. For survivors, the idea of legacy carried particular weight. It affirmed that their voices mattered not only as testimony of pain, but as guidance for change. Every story shared, every boundary defended, Every step towards safety helped transform private suffering into collective knowledge, knowledge capable of protecting someone else on another ordinary day. And so the future, though forever marked by absence, was not empty. It held the steady work of compassion, the courage to confront what is difficult, and the enduring belief that protection is possible when people choose to see, to listen, and to act. Within that belief lived a quiet form of hope, one not untouched by sorrow, but strengthened by the determination that loss must never be meaningless. To remember, then, is to choose presence over comfort, the willingness to look steadily at what hurts so that it cannot quietly repeat itself. Memory becomes more than reflection. It becomes guidance, shaping how communities speak, how institutions respond, and how individuals care for one another in moments both ordinary and urgent. Compassion, when carried into action, changes the texture of daily life in subtle but enduring ways. It lives in the courage to ask difficult questions, in the patience to listen without judgment, and in the resolve to believe someone's fear even when the evidence is not yet visible to others. These choices, small in isolation, gather strength together until they form a barrier against the conditions where violence once hid. In this way, awareness is not a single moment of understanding but a continuing practice, renewed each time a survivor is supported, each time prevention is taught, each time a life is met with dignity rather than dismissal. Through that practice, loss is neither denied nor allowed to stand alone. It is carried forward as instruction, urging the living toward greater care. And so the story does not end in tragedy alone. It continues wherever remembrance becomes protection, wherever sorrow is transformed into vigilance, and wherever love, refusing to disappear, insists on shaping a safer world for those who remain and those still to come. They gather in quiet rooms and open courtyards, speaking softly so that grief does not harden into silence. In shared stories, in hands held a little longer than before, something gentle begins to return. Time does not erase what was lost, yet it teaches the living how to carry it, like a fragile light cupped against the wind. And in that careful keeping, hope finds a way to breathe again, reminding the world that even after the deepest night, the human heart still turns toward dawn. And in that hope, small acts begin to matter more than grand declarations. The watchful kindness of a neighbor, the courage of someone who chooses to speak, the quiet resolve to build homes and communities where tenderness is never mistaken for weakness. Change rarely arrives as a single moment of triumph. It grows slowly, carried in the decisions people make each day to value life, to listen, to protect, to care. What was broken cannot be undone, yet meaning can still be shaped from memory. Love, once given, does not vanish. It settles into the lives it touched and continues forward in unseen ways, guiding hands, softening hearts, and reminding the living that compassion is stronger than cruelty. And as long as that compassion is chosen again and again, the story moves onward, not defined by loss, but by the enduring light that refuses to fade.